Insight.
Today on Insight, we take a look at the world of open source software and the applications and uses it has in our everyday lives. Open source has exploded over the last decade, with brands such as Linux, Firefox and OpenOffice being commonplace in our computers. How did the open source software movement come about, and what benefits does the open source movement have when it comes to innovation? To help answer these questions, I spoke with Adam Jenkins from the University of South Australia, who is a lecturer with an interest in open source software. Could you explain what open source software is?
In essence, the thing about open source software is it's software where you conceive the programming and modify the programming that was used to create the software. And that's then provided to people free so that they can make changes or use the software directly. What we tend to think of it is just being free software, stuff you can download and run on your computer and get some use out of it without having to actually pay anything. The reality is it's a little bit more than that, because it's software you can also make changes to and modify and be involved in creating.
How long has open source software been around?
The concept, if you're referring to the whole idea of a free software movement, has been around for ages. That goes back a long way to early days in the 60s and so on in computing, where there was a push to try and get software for people to share what they were doing. So we had a big community emerging around Berkeley and so on in the US who were writing software and doing things on the mainframes and so on, and they wanted to share what they were doing. In such a way that they could then say, look, I wrote this, why don't you have a look at it, why don't you play with it, why don't you come up with something else? And so they started that whole movement. The actual concept of open source is comparatively new, and it was sort of a response to the problems that this idea of free software, which comes from earlier, had when it hit businesses. So open source was a response saying, well, there are ways we can do it which is actually an advantage to a business while still providing things that's free.
So what was the catalyst for the modern movement, so to speak?
There's this really nice summary which I've always rather liked, and it basically says that free software exists because it's the right thing to do, and that open source software exists because it's the better thing to do. Open source software emerged because people were saying, well, free software has this whole philosophical approach behind it that says we write this stuff and make it free to everybody and everyone learns from it. Open source emerged because they were trying to say, well, no, that's great, but what business wants is actually a reason why they should be embracing this sort of thing, getting involved in it. So the open source movement came about with this belief that it's actually a better way of developing software, rather than necessarily some sort of philosophical basis. So it's inherently pragmatic compared to the free software movement.
So why is it a better way of producing software?
Let's say that we've got a small business and I decide I want to write some software that I need for my business. I'm presuming that the business's core purpose isn't really to design software. They're doing something else, so whatever it is that their business does, but they need some particular software for their business. One of the options they would have is to try to write it completely in-house, pay for people and get a lot of people involved and try to build the software that way and do it themselves on their own budget. What open source says is that one of your options would be to open it up, to say, well, I don't actually need to own this software completely myself. What I need to do is be able to use it. So the business will start the software, and then it will invite the open source community by making it open source to become involved, and then they'll come along and provide skills, hopefully, and they'll develop the software for you and help carry it and help maintain it on the grounds that then they'll be able to use it and other people will be able to use it as well.
What benefits does open source software have over proprietary software?
It depends on which direction we're looking in. The neat thing about open source is we tend to see it in really two areas, or perhaps three. The first is the idea that, whatever else, we're still getting free software. So the big benefit there for businesses, and it's not absolutely clearly cut because there's a lot of other issues around this, but basically you can get yourself an operating system and a word processor and a whole stack of other things that you might need on your computer without paying anything for it. So just for the simple basis of free software, you can set yourself up and get your business going and get all the basic software cheaper than you would do if you went proprietary. On the next level up, there's the idea that with open source software you can see the code, and because of that you can modify it and customize it and make it do exactly what you're after. I'm trying to think of clever analogies, and the best I can get to is the idea of a car, that you can, with open source software, you've got the option of buying the software just like you'd buy a car and then making aftermarket modifications that suit you. And the same thing will happen here. You can get your software, download it for free, and then make changes that customize it in such a way that it will meet what your business needs without actually having to write it from scratch or necessarily to go back to the original proprietary owners and get them to develop it. And the third one is, of course, in the direction of trying to write it yourself. If you're trying to write your own set of software, and I encountered this once because I was trying to do it. I was writing some software. I thought it'd be really good for teaching, was quite pleased with it, and found out I'd sort of hit a wall that, yeah, I can code a bit, but I'm the worst graphic designer you're ever going to encounter. So I put it onto open source and asked for people to come in and do some graphic design and help me with a project in return for providing the software free. And the result was that I got people with skills that I needed who said, yeah, they'll come in, and they did some really good graphic design for us and did some of the other things I needed. And the result was a program that was a lot better than I could have done on my own.
So because the code is actually being able to be seen by everyone, are there any real risks to businesses and government where they might actually not feel safe using the software, knowing that the actual background code is known to everyone?
Yeah, we tend to hit two problems there. The first is your whole IP problem, so that's your intellectual property rights, that you wrote the software. If it offers you a competitive advantage or something, or if there's part of the code that you really would like to keep yourself, then we have a little bit of a problem there. In particular, in the case where you're using or making modifications which are going to give your competitors a competitive advantage if they got hold of it. But the open source, the whole idea of open source is you share your changes. So therefore, you're going to be in a bit of a hole there. Technically, there's also a risk of security problems. The extent of that risk is really, really hard to judge. I'm not sure it's really clear where we sit on that one. On the one hand, people can see the source code and they can work out how it works and possibly find security holes. On the other hand, when they are found, the responses to it tend to be very quick because they can be fixed very, very rapidly by a large team of people who have access to the source. And there's also a chance that people who are going to fix the problems will spot it before anyone else does, because there's a whole lot of different eyes looking at the source code who potentially could see the flaws and get rid of them. And so a lot of the big name, really fancy open source products like Firefox have had comparatively few security problems because they tend to get picked by the large number of eyes looking at it beforehand. But I would still argue there'd be a risk that if people can see the code and there are flaws in it, then they're more likely to spot it.
Where do the ideas for open source projects come from? Are the initial ideas from proprietary software, or are there some original ideas?
Yeah, it gets really complex because there's a big chunk of open source software which exists because there isn't really a proprietary equivalent to it. For example, a nice one which I was thinking about was Wikipedia. Underlying Wikipedia, the whole wiki software that runs it, called MediaWiki, is an open source project. And so therefore there isn't really a commercial equivalent. Somebody said, hey, there is now, I suppose, but not when MediaWiki was being developed. People were saying, I've got this great idea, we want to develop it, we're not sure it's actually marketable, but let's muck around with it and build something anyway and build it open source. So for some of the specific ideas like that, they often come open source first because the person who has the idea isn't necessarily also somebody in a position to develop a proprietary product and market it and do all of that. Instead, they just sort of announce their idea, develop themselves, get a team of people behind it and build it from there. That said, an awful lot of it looks horribly like commercial software. When you have a look through the word processors and the operating systems and a lot of the other things that they release, they're clearly getting ideas from existing products, and a lot of them blatantly so. They're very clearly based on ideas that have come elsewhere. But I don't think it's an either-or thing. I can't see a situation where open source will be so successful that suddenly proprietary will die, any more than I can see proprietary killing off open source anytime soon. So I think they can comfortably feed off each other for a while yet.
So finally, what should people think when they think open source software?
I think one of the things I was thinking before is that the extent in which we use open source without ever actually being aware of it. Because you get this tendency to think, well, I don't use it, I don't use Linux. You think the big names like Linux and Firefox and so on. Sometimes people are using it without even realizing Firefox is open source. But what I find really interesting is just how much the internet actually relies on open source software in ways we don't understand. So when we are surfing the web, it's very likely that there's a good chance you're using Firefox or something, so that's open source. But what's more interesting is what's happening on the other end. The computer which gave you that web page you just asked for, there's a very good chance that it's running open source software, because the Linux and the big name, some of the other big open source operating systems are very common on the servers that deliver the pages to you. You also find that the software which is actually doing the delivery, a product called Apache, takes up vast numbers of websites around the world, and that's open source. And I'd reckon there's very good odds that any time you visit a web page that it's being delivered to you from an open source package. Behind that, the software which probably was used to produce that web page is open source. The software that may have been used to do the graphics is open source. So it's all sort of there, but it's behind what we can actually see. So we tend to get caught up in the idea that OpenOffice or Linux or so on are open source, but I don't use them, without realizing just how much we're relying on it in the background.
So there you have it. Open source software exists, and it does have some real-world applications. From Wikipedia through to the way websites are created and delivered, it is likely open source software is being used, or has been used at some point, to deliver the content. I would like to thank Adam Jenkins for joining us on the program today. I'm Matthew Sampson, and this has been Insight for Homepage.